This one is not damaged, unfortunately.
Okay, welcome everyone. So it's a pleasure to welcome you to Tilburg for the 5th edition of our Tilburg Macro Conference. We're very excited about the program we're having today and tomorrow. So just to remind everyone of the rules, so every session is 45 minutes, like 30 minutes for the presentation, 10 minutes for the discussant, and then 5 minutes for open for discussion. But we do encourage you to ask questions during the presentation. We want them as interactive as possible. I should also say thank you to the financing, so that we get financing from the European Banking Center at Tilburg University and from STEG, Structural Transformation and Economic Growth. I think that's all I could say, right? Okay, so then our first presentation is by Ralph de Haas from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. So he's going to tell us about technoparks and firm upgrading. So I have the perfect.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be back in Tilburg, in my home country. It's very nice to hear my name pronounced, Doesn't happen that often, so thanks for that as well. And it's a pleasure to open the conference in a way, I guess. So this is George work with business at the Central Bank of the Republic of Turkey, the Central Bank. Aslan Yilmaz as well, Thuy, who is at the EBRD, and Francesco Loiacono, who is also the chief economist. Okay, so this is a paper about a place-based industrial policy, really, innovation zones, or commonly called technoparks, that have become increasingly popular in many countries, currently mainly in emerging markets and lower income countries, but historically, or if you go back to the 60s and the 70s, these technoparks were already being established in many, let's say, richer countries in the US, in France, in the UK, in Germany. A lot of countries have been experimenting with these parks, but currently you really see them being rolled out quite intensively across many low and middle income countries. And so the idea of these parks is that you basically create clusters, often close to universities, where innovative and entrepreneurial firms can cluster together with the idea that you provide them with financial incentives, but also the physical infrastructure for them to work together, to build bridges with both the university and the community. With the explicit idea that not only the firms in those parks, which we call tenant firms, are going to thrive, but also that you create positive spillovers to local firms around these parks, right? So in the case of this paper, we're going to look at districts. And so one of the objectives of these programs is that you create these clusters, but they are basically broader positive spillovers to the local economy, or so the story. So a lot of this is about firm level upgrading, so helping firms to become more productive by allowing them to innovate more, to adopt technologies from elsewhere, but also to do more in-house innovation themselves, and to upgrade their processes and the products that they produce, which we call firm-level upgrading, shorthand form. Of course, that's important for these firms themselves, but the idea is also that this helps with moving countries forward on the path of convergence to richer countries, and so it helps with, STEG was already mentioned earlier on, it helps basically with structural transformation of the economies that set up. Now, that's the story, or that's sort of the theory of change, if you will, but there's actually very little evidence on whether these technoparks work. So there's a very large literature on special economic zones, which have slightly different objectives, or other place-based interventions. But the literature on these technoparks is actually very limited, and we're going to use data from Turkey, where there has been a very large-scale rollout of these parks, to try whether we can detect in the data, we have very rich microdata, to see whether there is indeed an impact of these parks on local economies. So as I already mentioned, we have nice data that we can access only at the central bank in Turkey. So this is also one of the reasons why we have co-authors from the central bank. So there's a dedicated data center where you can access very granular firm-level data. So these are admin data on these firms, so balance sheets and profit and loss statements, but also all the trade transactions of these firms, both domestically but also with foreign partners. And you have data on all the employees, the type of machinery they buy, and so there's a lot of detail. And the nice thing is that these data come from different data sets, but they're all linked by unique firm IDs, so you can really connect sort of a nice, granular, but very well integrated data set. We complement that with a survey that we did of all technoparks in Turkey with the managers of these technoparks, just to get a better idea more descriptively of what these parks actually do, whether it sort of aligns with the stated objectives of the government, but also to see whether there's interesting variation across these parks and how they operate, how they manage, etc. So that's some of the variation that we're currently exploring in the paper. I'm not going to talk much about that today because that's still the main design that we're going to use is pretty straightforward. So we're going to look at the rollout, the staggered rollout of these technoparks across Turkey over time. We're going to look at the districts where these parks were opened, and then for each district we're going to find a match control district, not just anywhere in Turkey. We're going to look at the same NUTS 2 level, so think about it as a state in sort of US terms, and the district you can think about as a county. So we're going to look at very similar districts as the treated districts, and we're going to match that using propensity score matching. We have a robustness analysis in the paper where we have a broader set of controls that we're going to compare. Importantly, we're going to include firm fixed effects, but also district pair fixed effects interacted with year dummies in order to really see how these districts, the control and the treatment districts, are basically differentially changing over time, exactly at the point when the technopark gets introduced in the treaty.
Can you say how big are this? Is a NUTS 2 region? So I'm worried about two places being just close to each other. And you give slightly more incentives.
Yeah.
In place A and B, you might just draw from B.
Yeah. So the first part of your question is how big are they? So there are about 25 NUTS 2 regions in Turkey. So I will show you a map later on so you can see. So that's sort of in terms of geographic terms. So most of the districts, again, I will show you a map later on. So most of the districts that we look at, the treated districts, are matched with a control district that is not adjacent to the treatment district. Right. So they are in the same region, or let's say again in U.S. terms, they're in the same state, but there is non-treated space between them. We do, and I'm not going to talk about it today, but it's in the paper. We do a spillover analysis where we try to see exactly what you're alluding to, whether you're actually sort of, whether there are negative spillovers, or you're drawing talent from neighboring districts into your district, and so if that will be the case, that will be. The soft condition wouldn't hold in this setting. That's one way to think about it. We don't find evidence for that. If anything, we find slightly positive spillovers via trade linkages, which we could observe in the data. All right, so that's roughly speaking the design. I'll talk more about that time permitting. I already talked a little bit about the firm level outcome. So I think this is, if you will, the novelty of this paper. We have these, really neat data, so we can really look at the firm level, how these firms are changing once a technopark is introduced. Let me highlight again. I will say this probably too often in this presentation, but it's very important. We're not going to look at the firms that are in the technopark, which we call tenant firms, right? So there's a lot of stuff happening in these technoparks, and we have information on what is happening there. But what we are really interested in is the impact of the technopark on surrounding firms in the district in which the technopark is located. And so we call these incumbent firms. These are the firms that were already present at the point in time that the technopark was opened. Right? And so we really want to see whether these regular firms, if you will, or at least a subsection of those, are going to change their production structure, their production technology, the type of people that they hire, the type of products that they export domestically and internationally as a result of the technopark. Good. And then we will have at the end some regressions or some analysis at the district level as well to see whether there is a new inflow of firms, whether there are new firms being opened, and also whether there's churn, so whether firms are actually exiting. Okay, so this is not a map of Turkey. This is a map of one of these NUTS 2 regions where we have a treated district. And as I just mentioned, we have a control district in the same NUTS 2 area, but it's, as you can see in this example, it's and that's sort of representative for the data set. These are not adjacent. And so we're going to compare changes in the outcomes for these incumbent firms in the treated district to the outcomes for incumbent firms in the net control. This is what I just mentioned. We're not going to look at the firms, the tenant firms that are inside of these technoparks. And importantly, we have firm fixed effects, and we have these matched district pair times year fixed effects, right? So we're going to have a fixed effect for this pair, and then we're going to interact that with year dummies over time to flexibly account for changes happening in the economy at the level of the NUTS 2 region.
So are the firms in the technoparks foreign firms, or?
No, they are. Well, they can be. Very few are, but there's no rule that says that they cannot be subsidiaries of foreign firms, for instance. But they are mainly startups. So many of them are firms that. So these technoparks are being set up. I'll show you some pictures in a second. So it's just infrastructure. It's real estate basically, and then at some point firms start to emerge, right? So and many of them are actually new startups that are being set up, mostly by Turkish entrepreneurs or Turkish conglomerates. Many large conglomerates in Turkey that also set up startups, and few of them are foreign owned or foreign inspired, if you will. But that's a minority. Having said that, this is based on the survey that we did from of those managers, but we are not observing that in the data because we currently do not have data on the tenant firms in these technoparks. So that's something to keep in mind.
Do the parks have designated like predefined themes? Like one is chemicals, one is something else?
Yeah, a bit. Yeah. So that's a very good point. That's again, not in the paper today, because this is exactly one of the reasons why we did this survey, to try to understand how much heterogeneity there is across these parks. And one of the dimensions that we look at is sort of a focus on specific subsectors. So indeed, we see, just look at the data in areas of Turkey that are more rural, so say more towards the east. A lot of these firms have more like an agricultural R&D, developing new fertilizers, that type of thing. So you can see that they are very innovative firms. They do a lot of R&D, could come up with new patents and all of that. But it's very much focused on what the local economy is doing, which in a way makes sense. And they also explain why we find some of the spillovers that we find in the. All right, I'm going to skip this. Let me just say. There is, of course, and probably most of you are familiar with this literature, quite large literature on special economic zones, which have a slightly different, more general objective, right, to create employment and economic growth in specific sectors, or sometimes they have a specific trade component or focus. And there's a large literature on this. I think, in particular, the newer literature is showing that there are limited positive effects of these special economic zones. But in many cases, there are also genuine worries about displacement effects from nearby areas. So I think that's another main finding. And then a lot of these results, or these positive results, are very sensitive to the way these things are organized, right? So the devil is in the detail, and that holds here as well. Again, that's one of the reasons why we did this survey as well, to be able to see whether that holds in our settings. And then there's a whole different literature which actually focuses on these tenant firms. So they really focus only on what happens within these technoparks. And that's sort of a slightly left field, niche type of literature, which is very interesting, but it's more like a management literature focusing on the type of how these incubators work in these technoparks and in other place-based policies. But they really stop at the boundaries of the technopark. They don't have anything to say about what happens in the wider economy, which we think is actually the most interesting thing to see, whether there are wider spillovers or whether this is just, a very small group of firms clustering together doing interesting stuff without much positive impacts on the. Okay, so this is sort of showing you the rollout of these parks. Our data set, so our micro data, starts in 2009. So we are only able to look at what happens after 2009, meaning that we're also going to focus on the technoparks that were rolled out after 2009. There were about 82 established in those years, and so we're going to take a subset of those. I can talk about that a little bit more later on, and basically see how the rollout of that later wave of technoparks basically had an impact on firms in those districts where they were being set up. So what do these parks do? Very quickly, so I think it's a combination of a couple of things. First of all, very important, there are financial incentives. So there are all kinds of R&D subsidies, there are tax breaks for innovative activities for these firms. So if you're based in that park, you just have strong financial incentives to become more innovative, to develop new products, either by doing your own innovation or by adopting existing foreign technologies. There's a lot of things like patent assistance, so again, to help these firms to innovate. There are incubators, there's a lot of business development support. And importantly, there's a lot of focus, and that's also something we see in the survey about establishing linkages between firms within the park, but also between firms in the park and the local economy. And that's exactly what we observe in the micro data. So my co-author Shavab took these pictures, I think, a few weeks ago. This is a park that was established in 2011. So this is sort of the real estate, if you will, right? So this is what I mentioned. This could be here on campus, here in Tilburg, right? So you build this infrastructure. You have computer rooms. You have like an auditorium and a meeting space. And then, of course, what's more important is you have a lot of collaboration between firms in that park and all kinds of other partners. So there's a lot of matchmaking between firms in the park and outside of the park. This was a Chinese delegation, so if you think about sort of exchange of technologies with foreign companies, that's happening as well. There are training programs. There's again financial incentives. So this is sort of how these parks, just to give you a bit of a visualization of what these parks are actually doing. All right, I'm going to skip this. As I said, there's more in the paper about the survey that we did. Just to say that there's if you ask these parks what are you actually doing, you give them a whole menu of options. They tend to say, of course, that there's a strong focus on R&D and innovation, tech upgrading, and all of that. Much less on job creation, which is what you would expect much more in a general special economic zone, for instance. So that this is really not what they're focused on. All right, let's talk a bit more about the data that we're going to use. So I already mentioned we have this firm panel. So we have data on the universe of all firms. We focus on non-financial firms in Turkey, starting in 2009. Currently updating the data set a little bit because there's another 2 years of data. So that's about 245,000 firms. We observe them for about 10 years, so about 2.5 million firm year observation. I already mentioned here we have this information on firm-to-firm invoices, customs records, and we know exactly who works in each of these firms and what type of job they are doing, so we can look at that. Again, I already mentioned I was going to probably say this too many times. We're looking at the firms that surround these parks, the incumbent firms that were already there. We're not looking at the firms inside the.
Just a quick question: is it a balanced or an unbalanced plan you're looking at?
Unbalanced. So we have a number of robustness. So I think the main restriction that we have is that we observe the firm in 4 consecutive years, of which at least 1 before the establishment of the technopark. And then you can vary that. You can be more or less strict. And so we have a number of robustness tests in the paper. Right. So matching, as already said, we have the treated district in a NUTS2 region. We're going to find a control district that is similar at baseline. Baseline, we take 2009 as the baseline here. Again, you can have views about that. But currently, we're taking 2009, the beginning of our data set, as the baseline year. And we take a whole bunch of district characteristics in level, right? And we're just going to match as good as possible the treated district with a control district that looks observably as similar as possible. So this is the map I mentioned earlier on. So these the dark lines here are the NUTS2 regions, to give you an idea of how large these regions are. There's about 25. I think it's 24 in Turkey.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
So 2009, I don't remember exactly how hard Turkey was hit by the global financial crisis. Are you worried about this? I guess so. For some of these, if they're just kind of recovering from firm prices, then I guess this could be kind of varying by industry, and then you kind of match on some pre-trends that are then kind of playing out.
Yeah, well, so we have a robustness test in the paper where we start later for that reason. The other thing I would say is, I would mainly be worried about that if the matching wouldn't work. Well, so first of all, I would say I would be worried if the matching on observable levels would be really off, right? And so, because that would suggest that maybe these districts were hit asymmetrically by the crisis, maybe because of a position or whatever. But then the thing, of course, the proof of the pudding is in the end whether there are parallel pre-trends. So that would show up in the pre-trend graphs that we show in the paper. We don't find that. Yeah, but that would be one of the reasons why careful matching is important. Right, so this is basically comparing the treated and the. Is this working? This is treated and control before matching, so there are quite large differences. Then after matching, we managed to sort of reduce those differences overall, but also at the variable level quite a bit. I should point out, to be completely transparent, that a lot of these variables are in logs. So some of these very small differences that you observe here are actually in absolute terms still quite large, even though they don't show up here. So I think we need to change this table, to be honest. But again, even then, the differences are in most cases not statistically significant, even if you look at observable levels. And again, the most important thing, of course, that we do not see any strong pre-trends in the data where we compare these two tests. You can also do this. So these are district level variables, right? So like the political system and things like that, financial debt. You can also look at the firms that are operating there and see whether these firms are balanced on average, and you see that that's the case. So then the regressions that we run in the baseline. Yes, please.
Is this the reason you only match on one county and not several?
Yes, so we looked. We had 1 to 3 matching at some point as well. The matching quality detail. So the reason why we wanted to do that is because it just buys you a bit of efficiency. But the matching quality deteriorated quite quickly. So so in the end we got more bias for the trade-off between the bias that we introduced and the efficiency that we would gain was not a good one. So what we do instead is this other approach where we say, let's either do the one extreme, which is one-on-one matching, and we take the district and we match it as best as we can, or the other approach is we don't match it all, and I would say except for that we look at the NUTS2 region. We say we take the district and we just compare to all other districts in that, well, I should say all not treated or not yet treated districts in that NUTS2 region, and then we just compare what's going on. So that's otherwise we get into endless discussions about we have 1 to 2 matching, 1 to 3 matching, how are you matching and all. So I think that's we take these extremes and then we show that there's robustness where we take these two approaches. All right, so this is what we run. So on the left-hand side, we have Y, which is a number of firm I level, let's say firm upgrading outcomes. So whether they are engaged in high-tech exports, for instance. I will show you the concrete examples in a second. We have the Technopark indicator, which is time varying, obviously, and at the district level, district D, where firm I is located. And we have these firm fixed effects and the district pair fixed effects, P and T, in there as well. So basically what we create, if you want to think about, this is basically this is a two-way fixed effects estimator, but by including these matching district pair year fixed effects, we basically create sort of cohorts at the district pair level that we can then stack, and in that way we can circumvent or prevent some of these issues that this very large sort of exploding literature on two-way fixed effects problems with heterogeneous treatment effects has been looking at. And so we can basically prevent all of that by creating clean cohorts and stacking them on top of each other, which is sort of the Sengesel approach that they published a couple of years back. We also have a Borsiak estimator if you are more comfortable with that, but sort of addressing it within the estimation method. We can do that as well, and I will show you some results on that. All right. That was about to say time for some results. Do I still have time for results?
7 minutes. 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Okay, that should be fine. Okay, cool. So let's walk through some of the tables in the paper. And I should say some of these hyperlinks we were just discussing about that they were screwed up. So I'm not going to be able to go there, or I can go there, but I won't be able to come back to the correct slide. So to keep it simple, I will just describe what we're doing. So here, again, firm fixed effects, district pair, year fixed effects. The variable here on the left-hand side is basically about export. About domestic production. So we're going to see whether these firms, the likelihood that these firms are engaged in high-tech production, and so we have data on that from a OECD classification, where we basically decide whether a purchase or a sales is to a sector that is high-tech or medium high-tech. And so the likelihood, you can see here that basically that once the technopark is introduced, if you look at the firms in the district where the technopark is introduced, excluding the firms in the technopark itself, and you compare that to what happens to the firms in the control district in the same year, you see that the likelihood that these firms are basically engaging in high-tech domestic purchases goes up. And similarly, they are starting to sell more of these high-tech goods. So I think that's interesting. You can do that in event studies as well. So this is what I mentioned. This is sort of the stacked two-way fixed effects estimator. This is the Borsiak et al. Approach. You might say like, oh well, if you draw a line here, there's sort of a trend that's continuing. So shouldn't you worry about it? Yeah, probably. So we're doing some work on that. One of the things that we do is you have these Ramakan and Roth sort of M values, sort of breakdown values that you can look at to see how sensitive this is to extrapolation or linear or even nonlinear trends, and that gives you a bit of an idea of how much you should worry about trends in the.
So I mean the naive question: when you build the fact that the technopark is built means that there are some. It's almost like a. You would expect almost like a Keynesian effect, but you're gonna do some construction there.
Yeah.
I don't know to what extent that's going to involve that the firms around are going to basically deliver services, etc.
Yeah.
So I would feel a bit more very happy that the effect gets larger over time, because I think that's much more meaningful.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean so two things on that. So one, sorry, I'm just thinking of what you were saying there. So one thing that you should do probably in response to your comment is to, you can look at that. We have data on construction companies or real estate, right? And so we should see whether the impact is earlier in those parts, or there's maybe a bump, I should say. The other thing is we look at technopark openings, which is when the first firms move in and they start to operate, right? So suppose this would be a technopark here. So the period when this all was being built would not be the treatment. The treatment
-1.
Yeah. So basically, if your story may still be true, but if it would be dominating our story, we would have strong pre-trends here driven by construction companies, basically, or a strong maybe not a pre-trend, but a strong anticipation effect in the pre-period. So we don't see that when we look at all firms, but I think it would be very interesting to see whether that's happening for specific sectors, and I think that could be. You can do that with the data. It's a great suggestion.
Quick question here. These are not purchases from the firms in the technopark, right?
No. They are not. Let me be precise. So we don't know. That should be my answer. So it's not limited. The issue with our data currently is that we have information on where these firms are located at the district level, but we don't know exactly. We don't have the geo coordinates, for instance, so we don't know whether they are inside the park or not. The only reason why we know that they are not inside the park, these firms are not inside the park, is because we look at incumbent firms that were already there before the technopark was built, right? So that's sort of like construction, we exclude them. Oh yeah, thanks for that. So that also means that I'm going to, but I hope that answers your question. Okay, so let me, in the interest of time, let me walk you through some of the other results. I'll do that very quickly. So they're engaging more in high-tech sales and also consumption, if you will. We look at exporting. So exporting data are actually much nicer because here we have 6-digit HS level product data, so we can really observe very specifically what they are exporting. And so when we do that, we see there's an increase in high R&D intensity exports. Again, if this would work, I could give you the exact definition. And also high-tech exports more generally, we see a pickup of that as well. We don't see much on general exports or exports of low tech. So you might imagine this is just, these firms are exporting more in general. So we don't see that is in the data. I'll show you that. So similar event study charts here. We look at mechanisms, or maybe channels would be a better word. So we can look at basically business linkages. So are there new linkages being established between these firms in these districts relative to the similar firms in control districts? And so we see that is the case. So if you look at the customers that these firms are dealing with, whether they are high-tech or low-tech, we see that they are doing more trade with high-tech customers. And that holds within the district. So this could potentially be with firms in the technopark, right? We can't distinguish that, but that could be the case. But we also see positive effects, although they are smaller and less precisely estimated, with firms in other districts, which of course by definition cannot be the firms in the technopark. So this is, one part of the answer to your question. All right, and then let me maybe talk briefly about this last result, which I quite like. So here, this is data from existing Asimoville classification of type of capital goods that these firms are importing. So again, we have all the data on the invoices that they use when they are trading, including importing. So we can see basically what goods they are importing and whether there's changes in what they import once the technopark is introduced. And so we see that is the case. So there's a higher likelihood in those technopark firms that incumbent surrounding firms are actually starting to buy more of these high-tech automation goods used for, or presumably used for automating their own production processes. We can look at high-tech employment as well, so very similar. This I already mentioned. So, for instance, if we look at low R&D exports, low-tech exports, we basically find no results there. So this is not just a general exporting effect. It's really specific type of goods, again, using the 6-digit HS classification, where we can really pinpoint that there's an effect going on. And then we look at TFP as well, sales per worker. We find effects. Some of these effects are delayed, which again, I guess, is something you would expect, that doesn't materialize from day one. And then we look at basically district level outcomes as well. So we basically show that if you look at new firms, so this is no longer focusing on incumbent firms, but basically what happens in terms of firm entry and exit. We do find that there's more firm entry. We don't see anything on firm exit, and the firms that enter around these parks are actually more likely to be high-tech firms. Okay, let me stop here. So there's a whole bunch of robustness. Some of that we already discussed in response to your questions. So we see, to wrap up, we do find some evidence. I think quite consistent evidence. The effects are very present across all of the outcomes that we look at, and they are sizable, not massive, but I think they are sizable. They increase over time as well. So this is also one of the reasons why we're collecting new data as well. And eventually, with some delay, they also show up in average firm performance. Now we see that there's, if anything, a bit of crowding out of local firm activity. What we're currently looking at, I think, which is very important, is one that was already mentioned. So we're going to look at, in a much more serious way, at spillovers to either neighboring districts, but we can also, using the complete data on the firm-to-firm network, see whether they are maybe more trading with completely different parts of the countries, maybe some of the bigger cities. And so we want to see what those networks are doing as well. So these spatial linkages is something that we can explore more. And we're looking at basically conditional average treatment effects, depending on some of these, some of the heterogeneity that we can observe across technoparks, based on the estimate survey that we did with these technoparks. So thanks a lot, and sorry for running out of time. Thank you.
Then we now have a discussion by Guzman Ourens.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us in this new edition of the conference. I'm very happy and excited about this. So I'm very happy to discuss this paper. So I'm working mostly on growth and the intersection of growth and trade literatures, and in both you have this kind of papers where you want to analyze how agglomerating firms can be beneficial, right? So in the trade literature there is all this looking at how that may boost exports in value, or even the quality of export, or the complexity or technological component of exports. And also in the growth, of course, literature, there is a lot of work looking at how this can boost R&D or just TFP growth in general. This paper is going to focus on technology spillovers to firms that are outside the technoparks. So I think that's an interesting angle. And especially this is good because they do have great data to do this. So I think the fact that they have such a rich data set where they can look at firm-to-firm transaction, they can really dig into what firms are doing, is kind of the main thing that they are going to explode, and adds a lot of value to the paper. So I'm not going to explain the design again. I was planning to, because most people sometimes they do a great job at explaining the setting properly in such a limited amount of time. But he did great, so I'm not going to bother you with this. So they are looking at firms outside the technoparks. That's the kind of important part, and they're comparing to firms that are in the same region, in a different district, not contiguous, and close by. So I think that's a nice way to do it. I'm going to have some pointers about it, but I think overall it's well thought out. They do face shortcomings coming from the data. So data, the location of firms, it's only on firms' headquarters, and this opens up a bunch of potential problems. The main thing is for firms that are multi-establishment, maybe that's not reflective of the actual firm activity location, or there may be some room to firms to try to play with where the headquarters is located to take advantage of the tax breaks that technoparks give. So I would recommend to run the same thing, but with only single establishment firms. Try to just as a robustness check. I think it would alleviate a lot of doubts. And then the other thing is that they have data, or they're using data mostly from 2009. But technoparks were the law that kind of fostered these technoparks was passed in 2001, and there were already a bunch of technoparks installed since 2001. I think in this kind of short decade, 1/3 of them were already installed, or at least 1/3 of what they are using. So kind of the question is, what are we doing with the pre-existing technoparks, and how maybe using a measure of distance of every firm to the nearest technopark is also something that you can exploit to just kind of cope with this a bit more thoroughly. Then from the setting, of course, the obvious comment is that the location of technoparks is not going to be random. So the paper, of course, acknowledges this, I think, pretty well. They use propensity score matching to select similar controls within the same district. Within the same region. And they focus on where establishments are located pre-treatment. Of course, the propensity score is something that is kind of revived, especially in this literature, but it still has some problems. Mainly, you're matching districts that are similar in the dimension that you're looking at. And the dimensions you're looking at, none of them is technological. So I think maybe squeezing in there one technological variable would make a lot of sense. And then the other thing that you're doing, and I think there are reasons to do it, and there are also reasons not to do it, is you're trying to keep it geographically contained. So you're comparing firms in two different districts that are not contiguous, but they do belong to the same region. And of course, there are reasons to do this because you want to control for whatever is happening in that region. But there's also reasons not to do it because there could be spillovers from the technopark to the control firms. I mean, that's possible, and that would bias your estimates downward. And there could also be activity relocation. I'm going to discuss this a bit more later. You do a great job at controlling for activity relocation in the extensive margin, right? So firms switching from a controlled to a treated area, but there's always room for intensive margin reallocation. So that can happen, and if that happens, then upward, that's going to bias upward your estimate. So I think it could be good to also test your results for control firms that are not necessarily close by, and I think that's kind of the best way to kind of tackle this with your available data. And as a robustness, of course, I do think it also makes sense to do it the way you do it. So doing both, it's better than doing just the one. And yeah, you check, you're very cautious about parallel pre-trends. That's great. But of course, latent kind of how technology was kind of evolving pre-treatment, it's hard to measure. I think you do a great job at looking at pre-trends in many dimensions, but I think from the technological side, you can also do a bit more, maybe looking at patents or stuff like this, like in a and check parallel trends in this kind of technological dimension of the data. So I would recommend that. Yeah, so then, I mean, I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on the Turkish economy, so I'm curious about what other policies could have been implemented at the same time with technoparks and could become kind of co-founding results. So I'm wondering also how much authorities were invested in these kind of policies, how much they were selling them to the public, and they were kind of eager for them to work, and then what other things they could have done to do this. Yeah, and I think activity reallocation I already mentioned. You do a great job at trying to fix firms and control the extensive margin of activity reallocation. But in the intensive margin, I think you have room to do a bit more stuff. Of course, this is kind of I mean, people can always ask for more stuff, and then it's your job to kind of decide what's worth it. But my job is to ask for more stuff. So that's what I'm saying. And then a couple of questions just to conclude. So of course, this kind of policies come at a fiscal cost. You want to try to compare that. Just one phrase, how the cost compares to the benefits to provide like a more complete assessment. And this is very minor. It's just I would appreciate for you to provide descriptive stats on the district. But I was surprised that you mentioned that there are a lot of zeros, and then you need to, when you log these variables, you need to add a constant. I'm wondering why are there zeros in this data? I mean, it's very surprising to me. Forget about this last comment. This is stupid, but in general, I'm curious to see how these districts look like in terms of descriptive stats. And that's it. Thank you.
Well, if you want, you can.
Yeah. Thanks, Guzman. That was great. I really appreciate it. So there's some really good ideas. Yeah, we're perfectly right to ask for more, so that don't hold back. So a few things. So I think you had a very simple but important suggestion to just look at the single establishment firms, which is the vast majority of firms. So we actually do something more complicated. We have data on in which establishment of multi-establishment firms most of the employees are located, and so we basically say, well, the real headquarters is where most of the employees are based. But I think your suggestion is actually simpler and therefore better, so we should just do that. Matching on at least the tech variable, again, we can do that as well. I think you're right about the sort of a related comment on the fact that there might be sort of latent technological differentiated pre-trends between the two districts that we don't observe. So I think we can try. Of course, if it's really latent, it will be very difficult. But we can see whether there's some proxies that we can use. And so then other policies. Well, of course, this would really what would need to happen is that there would be policy that would consistently be introduced in tandem with the open technopark in each of these districts. I don't think that's what's happening, but what we can do and what we're doing based on the survey, we can see that there's variation across these parks. Very interesting. And then the final thing, the back of the envelope. Yeah, my co-authors are really pushing for this as well. I think it's a hopeless exercise, but I'll pass on your comment. But because I think it will be, you need to have a good idea of the fiscal costs involved in terms of the incentives that are being given, which I think will be very difficult to get data on. And then you need to have information on, what the costs were of building the infrastructure, of the salaries of the people that were. I don't know how to do this. It's a very valid point. But I don't think it will be entirely straightforward. So, but ongoing discussion within the author team. So I will pass on the message. Thank you again.
Good. So we have time for one or two more questions. Someone, this one. Diego. Theodore and Diego.
I guess very quickly, I think it will be interesting if the data allows you to say something about the channels through which these spillovers happen. And so that, I asked about the foreign firms because maybe, if there were differences there, then it would suggest maybe knowledge diffusion. But it could be, I think it will be, for the modeling perspective, if you can say something about channels. I mean, a former student of mine had done something on the industrial parks in Vietnam, which were very successful in bringing productivity growth. What's interesting there is that there were spillovers that happened across sectors. So these industrial parks were mostly manufacturing firms, foreign firms for exports, but big effects on agriculture and services, which is interesting. And so I think it would also be interesting to see if, I suppose here it won't really, a lot will be within sector, but it will be if you find also that cross sectors.
I think that's a great point, in particular the foreign bit. I mean, because a big part of the story, in particular in Turkey, is about not just frontier innovation within the country, like real new R&D, but also importing foreign technologies, which may be facilitated by multinationals or just foreign. So I think if we should look into that. That's very, very interesting.
Yeah. So I was wondering about spillovers and how to measure, in particular, trade diversion. Would you do something similar, looking not at the firms that were in those districts, but kind of like their incumbent partners? And think of whether sales to those incumbent partners is now declining, whether they're diverting towards perhaps new firms.
Yes, that's a very good point. This is what we're actually doing at the moment. So we're looking at sort of the pre-existing trade network, or your incumbent partners, as you call them. So we are looking into, we're seeing to what extent pre-existing suppliers or customers are being ditched, basically, in favor of new high-tech ones. So we're doing that. I think that's a very nice suggestion.
Kjetil has the last question.
Okay. So you're interested in the amount of technological upgrading, you measure it through the purchase and sales of high tech. What about more traditional measures of agglomeration, say patenting or the extent to which, one way in which technological upgrading takes place is, for example, imagine there is less textiles and more high-tech industries. We just report stuff about their industry shares.
Yeah.
More I understand that, and you firmly somehow in the middle sphere there, but I think we ultimately And the macro question is what we're interested in.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I think we're pushing very much because the angle that we push is a lot that we have these really neat micro data, and this is very few papers have actually observed this. But I think I agree. In the end, in particular in Turkey, a big question is how about structural transformation and how whether in a way the country is whether it's possible to shift your comparative advantage as a country basically into different sectors, and so trying to answer whether this policy might move the needle a little bit. Is very interesting. So yeah, I would need to think more about what we can say without overclaiming. I think maybe that's the maybe we want to be a bit.
We start the second session. Yanran is presenting her paper on learning in the shadows. You have 30 minutes, and then I'll have the time, and I'll give you like 5 minutes, 3 minutes.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for including our paper in this nice program. My name is Yanran. I'm from Tilburg University. Today I'm going to present a joint work with Roberto, who is a PhD student from UNC Chapel Hill. Well, in this project, we look at the informal sector entrepreneurs. Very broadly, informal sector firms, they just a bunch of business who don't register themselves to the tax authority. Very broadly, the informal sector firms, in terms of business activity, they look very similar to the formal sector firms. They just avoid all the taxes and regulations. And we care about informal sector because a lot of developing countries, they feature a huge informal sector. Usually, this sector accounts for around half of the employment, half of the firms, and at least 1/3 of the aggregate output is produced in this sector. So understanding the causes and consequences of the informal sector is crucial for not only academic research, but also for, effective policy making. So the standard view about the informal sector is that usually people think informal sector reflects, tax evasion or low productivity. But what we're doing in this paper is that we're going to provide a very different perspective to think about informal sector. Basically, we're going to argue that, informal sector is not all about distortion. Maybe it's doing something useful. For example, informal sector may serve as a cost-effective platform for people to experiment with their business idea, to learn about their business quality. So in today's talk, first I will provide you with some, new facts about the informal sector from Brazil. Then I'm going to introduce a model with learning that helps reconcile all these new facts. Then I will do some policy counterfactuals. So let me start with some facts about informal sector in Brazil. We're using the household and the firm survey from Brazil to do this analysis, and we're looking at the non-agriculture sector individuals, working age individuals with a job record. We identify entrepreneurs by their occupation information. So the entrepreneurs in this paper, it includes the self-employed people and employers. Then we identify informality based on their tax registration status. So if the entrepreneur says that there is a survey question asking the entrepreneurs, did you register your business? If the answer is yes, it's formal. Otherwise, it's informal. And just like any other developing country, Brazil also has a very high entrepreneurship rate. Around 1/4 of the working age population, they are entrepreneurs. And it has very high informality rate. Almost 3/4 of the entrepreneurs, they're running business in the informal sector. And we found something that is quite similar as what is suggested by the previous literature. That is, on average, the informal sector firms are owned by people with lower education level. And the informal sector firms have lower profit and they have lower productivity. Now, starting from there, we're going to take one step further. We're going to ask, okay, would there be any heterogeneity among these informal sector firms and among the informal sector entrepreneurs that could be hidden under these aggregate statistics? And we explore this by looking at the income distribution. So this figure shows the share of entrepreneurs by each income decile group. So if you look at the left-hand side of this income distribution, okay, and the red is for informal sector entrepreneurs, the blue is for formal sector entrepreneurs. If you look at the left-hand side of the income distribution, you see a lot of red. This result is not surprising at all because this is exactly what is suggested by the previous literature. Poor people, they're in the informal sector. But the surprising result is when you look at the right-hand side of the income distribution, you also see red. So the right-hand side of the income distribution, they are the top income people, the high-income people. So this result basically suggests, well, many of the top-income entrepreneurs, even the top-income decile, the richest 10% in Brazil, many of these top-income entrepreneurs, they are actually running business in the informal sector. And when we take a closer look at the top-income entrepreneurs and their business, we found that they look very similar to their formal sector counterparts in terms of the entrepreneur's education level, in terms of the firm profit and firm productivity. And the next thing we do is that we look at the transition dynamics. Yes?
So I guess there's some correlation between informality and legality of the business, I could imagine. So at the top, you might have some, what you could call illegal businesses. Could that be in there, or is that out of the picture?
What do you mean by legal business? You mean the prostitution, drug trafficking?
For example.
No, that's what we're looking at. It's got, in terms of business activity, they're just like the normal business. They just don't register themselves. So in that sense, because they're avoiding all the taxes, in that sense, they're illegal, but they're not super illegal.
So, I mean, if you go to a country like, for example, Italy, it's going to be, say, a medical doctor that has a formal, has a formal firm,
yes,
but also serves people.
Exactly, yes.
And it's that counted as those mixture where you do some, not avoid everything. Is that what's informal here or not?
That's a very good point. So here, we just focus on your main job, your primary job. And in Brazil, we checked the data, more than 95% of people, they only have one job. And here, for all the analysis, we just look at your primary job. So the top-income informal sector entrepreneurs, they are running the business in the informal sector as their primary job.
But it doesn't make that much to make it to the 9th, 10th decile. I mean, imagine you run a construction company and you have 5 employees. Mm-hmm. Even if it's an informal one, I would think you would have relatively high income. No?
Yes, right. But this kind of, yes, intuitively.
What's the point you're trying to make with this graph? That they are not hot dog stands?
Well, the point I'm trying to make here is, first, this graph goes against the standard view about the informal sector. The previous literature, they think the informal sector are just a bunch of low productivity people. And this figure shows that, no, actually some top income guys, they're running business in the informal sector. And it's related to the next table I'm going to show you. So this table is a transition dynamic. Yes.
Do we think of the informal entities you identify as a lower bound? I guess you don't find all tax evaders. Probably you find some, but there are more that you can't even. Not everyone says that, yes, I tax evade.
Right, exactly. So they're kind of the concern people make in the report, because they're worried that if I report truthfully, the government will go after me. So even with this concern, you still see the very high informality rate, and you still see many of the high-income entrepreneurs running business in the informal sector. And you would imagine if everyone were reporting their status truthfully, this number would be even higher. You're absolutely right. So the number I'm showing you here, you can see it as a lower bound. Okay. And the next thing is the transition dynamics. So here in this table, it shows you the annual transition rate from informal to formal. And the overall, on average, 10% of the informal sector entrepreneurs switch to the formal sector in every year. And this transition rate increases in income. If you look at the top income decile, the transition rate goes up to almost 30%. Okay? And now let me show you why these facts are important. So basically, the finding I'm showing you here is that many of the top income entrepreneurs, they're actually running business in the informal sector. And more importantly, this top income informal sector entrepreneurs, they're more likely to transition to formal sector over time. So this observation kind of raised a natural question. Why would these highly productive entrepreneurs, like why would they want to start their business in the informal sector first, then take a jump to the formal sector? They're very productive, and they're the top income guys, and they will go to formal sector anyway. Now why bother? Why don't they just start their business in the formal sector from the beginning? Why do they want to go through the whole process? Start business in the informal sector first, then go to formal sector. So that's kind of, this thing is new. And in the literature, there is no theory about informal sector that account for this fact. Yes.
If I think of the Ulysses work, right, I guess, so in that paper, there's kind of cutoff at some point you formalize. And so he also identifies that there's 40% of firms that are like parasite firms that
Right.
it should be formed. But in that model, it's a very simple model, you would still have that at some point the probability rises that you're going to be detected. And so that's still consistent with what you're saying, right? Is that there's some successful informal firms, they have a tax advantage of not formalizing. But at some point, the government sees them and they're like, okay, now you have to form. So then it wouldn't be a choice of the informal firm, it would just be the government says, okay, now we see you. But this is consistent with what you're showing so far, no?
Intuitively, logically, it is consistent, but in terms of magnitude, we did the exercise. That model wouldn't generate this transition rate, this 10% transition rate. Right? That's why we need something else. So what is something else? We're going to provide a theory, and the key idea of the theory is business learning. The idea is very simple. Imagine that we're going to start a business, but the problem is we don't exactly know how good we are. We don't exactly know how good the business quality is. Now, what we need to do is that we need to go ahead and start the business and see how it goes. For example, I want to start a restaurant. Then the rational thing for me is not to start a fancy one in the downtown Amsterdam, right? Because I don't know how good I am, so the rational thing or the optimal thing for me is that maybe I just want to start something simple, something small. Maybe just a food truck at the street corner in front of the econ department and see how it goes. If I have customers lining up every day, those will be strong signals indicating that I'm really good. My business is really good. Then I should rent a larger space in downtown Amsterdam, hiring more waiters and waitresses. If it turns out that, well, my business can barely survive, I don't have so many customers, those will be strong signals indicating I suck. So I should either just go ahead, shut down my business, go back to be a college professor, or I just keep my business small. So that's the learning story. Now with this learning process going on in the economy with a large informal sector, this informal sector will emerge endogenously as a cost-effective platform for people to test the water, for people to experiment with their business idea. Why is that? Because learning in the informal sector is much cheaper than in the formal sector. Because if you want to start a small business in the informal sector just to learn about your business quality, you don't need to pay any entry cost, and you can avoid all the taxes. The downside of the running business in the informal sector is that first, as what he just pointed out, you need to keep your business very small because the bigger you are, the more visible you will be to the government. You're avoiding tax, you're doing something illegal. The bigger you are, the more visible you will be to the government. So the government will tax you and destroy you. So you have to keep your business very small. And also, just one second, and also you don't have access to the formal financial market, right? With the informal sector business, it's very hard for you to go to the bank and ask for the business loan. So those are the downside. But for you, when you're in the early stage of learning, this downside is not the urgent headache for you. You just want to have a small business because all you want to do is to update your belief, is to learn about your business quality, is to test the water. Yes?
I want to just know a bit more about context. You mentioned that the informal guys cannot really borrow money. But for example, can they also rent an office or something? What's the restriction if they are not formal? Just can.
If they are not, you can definitely rent a place. It's kind of here in this model, we just capture the key features of informal sector business. One is the likelihood of being detected by the government. The second one is a tighter borrowing constraint. Right? Yes. Yes.
From a theory point of view, why do you need the learning? Why not just say, it's when you're as long as you're imagine it's optimal to start out very small. Perhaps that's a constraint or something. Then you want to. It's cheaper to operate when you're very small. The optimal size is very small, given your capital. You can just as well be informal.
Right.
But then once you become big enough, you become formal. Then we deliver. Kind of what you see.
Very good point. Yeah, we did that. We did that because we did the financial friction story. Again, quantitatively speaking, that story doesn't give us enough transition from informal to formal. Right, yes. We did that. So it's just the quantitative reason. For quantitative reason, you need something else other than financial friction. Yes. So again, back to the story. So the intuition is that you start something small in the informal sector to learn about your business quality. Once you realize that you're actually pretty good, your business quality is high, you formalize your business. And you can rent a larger space and you expand your production and you have access to formal financial market. If it turns out that your business quality is low, you can just shut down your business, or you just keep your business in the informal sector, keep it small. So that's the whole intuition. Now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to translate the intuition into the language of the model. So I'm going to show you the model with business learning and sector choice. For the sake of time, let me give you a very high-level summary of the model. Yes?
Sorry, just before you go. So what's the precise definition of an entrepreneur for you in the data? So if I am just a simple gig economy worker and I just supply my work as a consultant here and there, I'm self-employed.
You're self-employed, then you're an entrepreneur.
And am I in the formal or informal sector?
Well, it depends on did you register your business or not. If your answer, yes, I registered my business, you will be counted as formal. Otherwise, you're informal. Okay, so I have the discrete time OLG model, and all the households, all the agents, they are risk averse with their RA utility, and there is no aggregate shock. So people enter the model economy at physical age 20, and they retire at 65. Starting from 65, people die with a positive mortality rate, and this rate goes up to 100%. So between 20 and 65, that's a working age. During the working age, in every period, people make the occupation decision. They decide, I want to be a worker or I want to be an entrepreneur. If they choose to be an entrepreneur, they further decide the sector. I want to operate my business in the informal sector or formal sector. So let me be very clear here. In this paper, we focus on the informality on entrepreneur side, on firm side, and we do not look at the informality on worker side. So if you choose to be a worker, it's very simple. You just supply your effective labor and earn the equilibrium wage. That's it. So when people make the occupation decision, it's based on two types of productivities. One is a working productivity that changes in every period according to the AR1 process. The second type of productivity is a business quality, the big Q, which includes two parts. One is a little q, that's an innate business quality. The other is E, that's a transitory shock. Okay, for this little q, in every period, the non-entrepreneurs, they will draw the little q from a normal distribution. You can think this little q as a quality of your business idea. So you draw a business idea, and if you choose to be an entrepreneur, that means you're going to implement this business idea. So the Q will stay fixed. If you choose to be a worker, that means you're not going to implement this business idea. The assumption we're posing here, we're having here is, if you choose to be a worker, you need to throw away your business idea. And
it's gone forever. You can never recover.
Right, yes. And in next period, you just draw a new business idea. So another way to think about this assumption is simply, we do not allow people to retain their business idea. This simplicity is just to reduce the calibration burden. So this is not a super important assumption. The super important assumption we're having here is this one. You draw the little q from the distribution, that's your quality of your business idea. The problem is you do not observe it. You don't exactly know the realization of your little q. And this E is a transitory shock. It's an ID draw from a normal distribution. You can just consider E as your luck. Okay, that's a luck in this period. Then in this slide, let me show you how we think about learning and how we model it. Because the entrepreneurs, they don't exactly observe their little q. All their decision will be based on their belief. So the new entrants, their prior belief is just the distribution where the little q comes from. Then with the belief, the entrepreneurs, they make their input decisions. They decide how much capital I want to use, how much labor I want to use for the production. Then the entrepreneurs use this production function to produce. After production, what the entrepreneurs do is that they can observe their output. And they know all the input decisions because they're the ones who made the input decisions. And they know the production function. So with all this information, the entrepreneurs, they can back out the value of the big Q. That's the overall business quality. The problem is they know the value of the big Q, but they have no idea how much it comes from their innate business quality, how much it comes from the transitory shock E. That's their luck. Imagine that in one period, I have a very high big Q. It could be the case that my innate business quality is high, or it could be the case that I'm very lucky in this period. I don't know which one is the case. But imagine that for 10 periods or for 100 periods, I always have a very high big Q. It must be the case that my innate business quality is high. The idea is simply you can be lucky for one period, but you cannot be lucky for 10 periods or for 100 periods. So this simply means the longer periods you run your business, the more signals you will have, the more precise belief you will have about your business quality. So this is the logic of Bayesian belief updating. So we're using Bayesian belief updating in this model to have entrepreneurs update their belief. Okay? And there is just one more thing I'd like to highlight here. It's an important point. Learning happens no matter which sector you're in. As long as you run your business, you will observe your output. Then you can update your belief. It doesn't matter you're running business in the informal sector or formal sector. All it matters is you run your business. So learning is now the key difference between informal and formal sector. The difference between this sector is about tax, is about regulation, is about financial friction, which is summarized in this table. So for entrepreneurs, if they want to go to informal sector, they don't need to pay anything. But if you want to go to formal sector, there is a fixed entry cost. And in the informal sector, you can avoid all the taxes and regulations. But in the formal sector, we just mimic the tax system in Brazil. There is a sales tax and there is a payroll tax. The formal sector entrepreneurs, they need to pay. And there are two kind of the downside of running business in the informal sector, which I already mentioned when I talk about the intuition. There is a size penalty. You have to keep your business very small in the informal sector. And this idea is modeled as a the size penalty, the size distortion, which is a convex function of the firm size. But you don't have that concern in the formal sector. And the informal sector business, they have a tighter borrowing constraint. Okay, so with this setup, we can write down the value function for all the types of agents in this model. I have 4 types: the old retiree, the young workers, the young informal sector entrepreneurs, and young formal sector entrepreneurs. Then we can define equilibrium. We can close the model. So the next thing I do, is I do.
Sorry, Yanran. Yes. So you can be detected and then be forced to formalize, or no? That's not part of your model?
That's not a part of my.
That's happening in the data, right, or no?
It's in the data we don't know, because in the data there is no survey question asking, okay, you formalize your business. Is it because you got detected in the last period? We don't know that. There is no such survey question.
But Nessie Connor and Santos have a paper on Brazil that has that information, and it's about this. So in any case.
Okay, I will check that.
I can tell you after, yeah. I think if it exists, you should have it as well, right? So you have the 2 sources of formalization.
Okay, great. Okay, I will definitely check that paper. I didn't know that. Thank you. Yes.
I have a quick question. If you're informal, you also don't have access to the formal labor market, right? So you cannot employ informal. Is this a constraint that's relevant for those firms, or not really?
No, in this project, we don't focus on informality on the worker side. It's kind of, we just have
the firms want to hire, perhaps they cannot hire anyone they want, right? So some workers would only get a formal job.
Right,
So that's
exactly.
also a constraint for the firm.
Exactly.
Maybe it's not relevant. Maybe those are just single worker type of firms, and they don't really.
Right, exactly.
Employment relevant for them?
Well, for informal sector business is not quite relevant because 92% of the informal sector business, they're self-employed people. They don't hire anyone. Right. But that's a good point. Yes.
I'm just trying to understand the decision-making process of the agent. So essentially, if you're a low S household, you become an entrepreneur. Then depending on whether you have high or low assets,
Exactly.
you choose the formality versus informality. Is that roughly the story, or?
Right, exactly. Exactly, yes. Okay. Then I can calibrate the model using simulated methods of moments, and this is not very interesting. It's just doing the standard thing. 5 parameters to be calibrated jointly. Okay, the next slide. This result is interesting. In our calibration exercise, I didn't match any moments related to transition, but the model is able to generate a transition from informal to formal. And more importantly, the model is able to generate the pattern that transition increases with income. Okay, now go back to your earlier question. Why not just a financial friction? This is the exercise we're doing here is that we shut down learning. We shut down information friction. We have perfect information. Everyone exactly observe their business quality. So it's kind of the mechanism here. It's just a financial friction. And the model can still match all the targeted moments pretty well. But the model doesn't give us enough transition. In the data, the transition should be 10%, but in the model with perfect information, just a financial friction, it's just a 1. So the idea is that if everyone knows exactly how good they are, they go to their optimal sector immediately. Yes?
I would think that whether you need learning also depends a lot on the exit rate. So people that quit their firm, their entrepreneurship career, because they learned that it's not profitable, and that is a mechanism that will be less present in the financial friction story only.
Yes, that's a good point. I haven't thought about it yet, but definitely I can check the exit rate. And I think I can match the exit rate. Yes, the exit rate, yes. But not for that purpose. You did mention a very good point. Thank you. Yes?
If you look at this transition rate by age, you have a life cycle model, so, and that story is running, so this may matter.
Yes. For the firm, for the firm, we did observe the homeship. I do have that, but I didn't include it in the slide. Thank you. Okay, now let me go to the policy counterfactual, and let me just show you because I'm running out of time, so let me show you the most important one. So this policy counterfactual we're doing here, we just validate the model against some policy evaluation results. Brazil actually had this formalization policy. It's called the Individual Micro-Entrepreneur Program. And there is an empirical paper by Rocha and his co-authors who studied the effects of this formalization policy. And they found something that is quite interesting and that cannot be explained by the existing theories about the informal sector. And this policy, this formalization program includes 2 stages. In the first stage, the Brazilian government just cut the entry cost to the formal sector. However, this policy didn't generate too much effect on reducing informality. And in the second stage, the Brazilian government just gave a tax cut to all the young and small firms in the formal sector. And this policy generated a more significant effect on reducing informal sector. The most puzzling part about this policy is, in the second stage policy, there are more firms in the formal sector, but it doesn't come from newly created formal firms. It comes from more transition from informal to formal. That means with this policy, people still want to go to informal sector first, but there is just more transition from informal to formal. So this result cannot be explained by any current, as far as I know, cannot be explained by any existing theory. And in our model, we just mimic these 2 policies, and we see if our model can generate predictions that are similar, that are consistent with these policy evaluation results. Okay, I know I only have 1 minute, so let me give you okay, great. Very nice. Thank you so much. Okay. So for the first policy, when I reduce the entry cost to the formal sector, you see the size of the informal sector doesn't change that much. The share of informal sector entrepreneurs only goes down by 3 percentage points. The idea is very simple. It's just about why people want to stay informal in our model. Broadly speaking, there are just 2 groups of entrepreneurs who want to stay informal. One group are those guys who have already completed their learning. They already realize that their business quality is super low. They can never survive in the formal sector. That's why they stay informal. So their formalization decision wouldn't be affected by the entry cost. The second group of entrepreneurs are those guys, they actually have very high business quality, but they just don't know it yet. They're still in the early stage of learning. So for these people, they still want to stay in the informal sector longer to have a better idea about their business quality. So the entry cost wouldn't affect their formalization decision either. So that's why in our model, you see that this policy doesn't reduce the size of informal sector that much. But in the second policy, when I give a tax cut to all the young firms in the formal sector, the size of informal sector reduced a lot. And also, because the tax cut, it lowers the learning cost in the formal sector. It encourages people to shorten their periods in the informal sector and to switch to the formal sector earlier. So if you look at the average years it takes for transition, it goes down from 3.6 years to only 2 years. And there is more transition from informal to formal. The number of switchers increases by 22%. But the important thing is, remember the puzzling part I just mentioned. In the real world, all the increased number of formal sector business, it doesn't come from newly created formal firms. In this model, we generate the same pattern. We don't have, in the new steady state, the number of entrants to the formal sector doesn't increase compared to the baseline economy. The intuition is, well, this tax cut, it lowers the learning cost in the formal sector, but it doesn't entirely eliminate the learning cost in the formal sector. So what people do is, in the baseline economy, because learning in the formal sector is so costly, people go to informal sector and stay there for a very long period just to have a super accurate belief. Then they make their formalization decision. But in the new steady state, learning in the formal sector gets cheaper. Again, it's not a zero learning cost. It's still a positive learning cost, but just a cheaper compared to the baseline economy. So what people do is that, again, they go to informal sector first, but now they don't need to have a super accurate belief. All they want to have is stay there just for several periods, have a rough idea. Then they switch to the formal sector and continue the rest of the learning. So we can generate this result. Then we also did another policy counterfactual.
Sorry, I think now you're out of time.
Yes. So let me just put it on the last slide. Again, I'm not in this paper. We're not defending informal sector. We're just maybe it's doing something useful. So you may want to consider about that. Thank you.
I nominate Jonas to run the ECB.
Okay. It was a pleasure to read this paper. I enjoyed it a lot. So let me first give you like a summary of what the paper is about. So it starts with 2 standardized facts. So the first one is that a large share of high-income entrepreneurs are informal in Brazil. And the second empirical fact is that high-income entrepreneurs that are informal are likely to transition towards formalizing their business. And then, so the research question they didn't answer is, why do these high productive individuals that we think about, they formalize, but why do they first be informal before they formalize? And the answer they're going to give is that entrepreneurs stay informal because there's a relatively low-cost environment to experiment, to learn about your true productivity. And once you know that the quality of your business idea is sufficiently good, you know that with high precision, you decide to pay the cost of formalizing, and then they're going to use the model to do some policy. So I think it's a nice paper. So they document some empirical facts. They have several data sets. They have quite a rich quantitative model. And also what is a nice thing is their policy counterfactuals. Some of these have also been implemented in the real world in Brazil, so they can compare the model outcomes with the results of these empirical results, and that matches nicely with it. But what I would say is the biggest downside of the paper, however, is that the evidence on the learning mechanism is relatively little. It's mostly like an interpretation through the lens of a model. There's not really direct evidence that it's really the learning mechanism that's what's going on. So to first go to the empirics. So the first graph is what we saw, and there was already some discussion on that during the presentation. So I think there are two stylized facts here. So the first one is we see the U-shaped pattern. So that's well known. So entrepreneurs, either they have a good idea, they're going to be high income, or there's some people that are low income and they just face difficulty getting income. So this is entrepreneurs. So this U-shape is well documented, and that's what is less well known, and I didn't know it before reading this paper. That's the fact of focusing on that. Usually we think these high income entrepreneurs tend to be formal, while the low income entrepreneurs tend to be informal. But here you show that also the high income entrepreneurs are quite often informal. And then the second fact you document is that transition from red to blue, so informal to formal for high income, is relatively high. So another plot you didn't show is about productivity. So this is value added per worker. So you see if you look across all firms, informal firms tend to be less productive than informal firms. That's the left-hand graph. Although there's quite a lot of overlap in the support between the two distributions. But if you zoom in on the high income decile next to the productivity distribution between informal and formal firms, it looks very similar. So one small comment on this first graph. So here you show income decile. So income I think refers to monthly income. But it's not exactly clear, is it last month income or income over the last 12 months? So what I'm thinking about, suppose these informal entrepreneurs have a very volatile income process. If you're just going to look at income last month, some might just have a really high income. You're going to go, that's why there's high income decile, but maybe their average income is actually relatively small. So it would be good to clarify that. And if it is last month, you may want to do some back of the envelope calculation to rule out that explanation. So now I'm going to go quickly over the model. So agents choose to be either a worker or an entrepreneur. So if you decide to become an entrepreneur, you draw an unobserved current productivity small q with every period as a transitory shock ET, and then your overall productivity big Q is just going to be the sum of the two. Then based on your beliefs on what your true productivity Q is, you're going to decide your inputs, and then you're going to observe how much output you produce during that year, or that period, you know your inputs, so then you know what was your big Q. Of course, there's this transitory shock, so you don't know yet what small q is, but you're going to Bayesian update on your beliefs of what your business quality small q is. So then, so that's about entrepreneurship, regardless of whether you like formal or informal, and if this choice being formal or informal. So that's the main difference. If you're formal, you're going to pay an entry cost that you pay once, plus on every period you pay a linear tax on your sales and on your wage bill. And if you're informal, the advantage is there's no tax, but then there's a probability that you're being detected. That's convex in firm size. If you're like small, the probability is really small to be detected. If you're big, it's going to be worse. So, of course, what you're going to see, if like a small firm, its advantage to be informal because you pay really this probability of detection is really small. And if you're small, you of course don't want to pay the entry cost plus a linear tax. But if you're big, you don't want to face this high detection cost, and then it's worthwhile to pay the entry cost. And on top of that, you have the financial friction. That is like difference between formal and informal sector. So this is the model in a nutshell. But now I'm going to go back to what is my main point about the paper, that like this mechanism here is assuming that there's like going to be like some Bayesian learning on what your true productivity is, and that's why you're going to stay informal. But as I already said, there's like actually little direct empirical evidence that this is really the mechanism that's going on, because it could also be something that's maybe a bit related to the financial frictions, like just in general, even I think absence financial friction. Suppose it just takes time to build capital. Then, if you're like just starting up, you have like a relatively low capital stock. I mean, that makes it, even if you know your productivity, it just takes a few years to build up your capital stock. As you have more capital stock, it becomes more likely to be detected. And then, so the first few years you stay informal. Then, as your capital stock grows, you become higher and higher income. Now you have like a high income. You're worried about detection, and then you're only going to formalize after a few years. Or some story about like access to contracts. You start as an informal business. You do some business with other firms. They are okay with doing business with an informal firm. But over some years, maybe they get worried about detection, and they tell you, I'm only going to continue to do business with you if you're going to be formalized. So there are like different, and of course it's only if you're going to become like big. If you stay small, then maybe they don't get it much. So I think there are other stories possible that could also explain it. And I think the paper at the moment doesn't do a great point of like really like pushing this this learning angle. So I think the paper would benefit the most by direct evidence on learning. So maybe you can do something by looking at growth trajectories of informal firms, and maybe there's something you can learn there. And also one other point is about, there's also a graph you didn't show about comparing formal to informal firms. So actually if you look at the top income decile versus all entrepreneurs are actually different type of people. So this is education. So if you look among high income people, of course, they're going to be more educated on the right versus low educated. But you see that both, that's the same for informal versus formal entrepreneurs. Well, if you look among all entrepreneurs, then the informal sectors are going to be most like low educated people, while in the formal sectors, most like high educated entrepreneurs. So in the model, like everyone is the same, right? I mean, this is like labor productivity, but you have that this labor productivity is uncorrelated with the business ID. But this one suggests actually like high educated people are more likely to be an entrepreneur in the income top decile. That suggests that like, I mean, if education is correlated with labor productivity, we also think that labor productivity is correlated with the quality of your business ID. So A, that makes it way more easier to learn. So if you in the model, strictly speaking, I mean, people observe their labor productivity if they work, so then they could also immediately get some additional signals on what their business quality ID is. And more general, it just seems to be that high-income entrepreneurs seem to be different type of people than the low-income entrepreneurs, and that's now also a bit absent from the model. So the last slide is about your policy counterfactuals. So one is a decline in entry cost, so you find it has limited effect. And the reason is that only those with accurate positive beliefs about their business potential will formalize earlier. So it's like a relatively small portion of the sample firms. And then actually what you get is that aggregate output declines. This is, I think, due to like labor still moving to the entrepreneurial sector, but there's also like a corporate sector that you didn't talk about during the presentation, I think. And then that one is going to shrink. So of course then one thought is a social planner actually going to prefer high entry cost? I understand your tables are all about output, not about consumption or welfare, and it's not, I mean, equilibrium definition was not clear whether, like, what happens to the entry cost, so maybe there's like lower entry cost, that cost goes down, so like consumption might still increase, but that was a bit of a surprising result, so maybe you want to clarify that, or maybe it is a result, but I was wondering how that happens. And then finally, they show that there's like a big effect if it's both a decline in entry cost and a low tax rate at the first few ages, then entrepreneurs still start informal, but they will switch earlier to the formal sector now because they continue to experiment while facing this low tax rate for the first few years. And then my final comment before I end is that, I mean, I know there are like countries that like have like different tax regimes or subsidies on firm aid, but there's always like one difficulty with implementation. It's like very difficult to measure firm aid, right? Because you can always start your business for a few years formalized, but then you can maybe have your spouse later register like a new business, have like a very similar ID, and then you, from the business perspective, you're like again like a new firm. So I'm always a bit skeptical about really the real-world application of these like age-based firm policies. But overall, I think it was a really nice paper, and I would push you to give a bit more direct empirical evidence on this learning perspective.
So maybe if you want to respond, otherwise we can also take some more questions. You decide a bit.
Okay, just for the main comment, the little evidence on learning, that's kind of the thing we're struggling with because the results are mainly from the household survey data. So it's not a long panel for the firm. So what we did is that we tried all versions, the current existing model for informal sector, and it's either the model it's either they cannot generate the new facts or the policy counterfactual are not consistent with the formalization policy, the policy evaluation results we showed here. So we end up with having the learning. And all other mechanisms you mentioned, broadly speaking, I think them as a productivity accumulation channel. So just you start something with low productivity, but you can accumulate your productivity gradually. So it's kind of, again, it belongs, for me, it all belongs to learning. So we have the Bayesian belief updating learning. What we have basically, you're suggesting the learning by doing. I start low productivity, but gradually by producing, I can accumulate my productivity. So in the end, at the end of the day, we're suggesting something similar. So that's the informal sector is not all about distortion, it's doing something useful. I think for that point, we're the same. Yes.
Yeah, I think it would be useful if you could distinguish a bit more between welfare and like productivity and output, like in the OECR paper. I think he's kind of trying to make a sort of similar point that the informal sector is not necessarily just bad or good, but they can be it plays different roles. And I think for that, I think distinguishing between those, I think that could maybe also provide a clearer take on why learning is the relevant macro foundation here, instead of any generic macro foundation that generates firm size profiles consistent with these transition rates that you have.
Thank you.
In your model, the threshold Q to exit increases with age, right?
The threshold Q.
You learn more about your Q, so even with worse Qs, you exit if you're older than if you're younger, right?
Your Q doesn't change.
The threshold Q. So the threshold observed Q that makes you decide to exit, I think that increases with time in your model, so that would mean that the quality of exiters is higher for older firms. So that could be, I think, good indirect evidence of.
Oh, great. Yes, all right. Thank you.
Jeff had one last comment, maybe?
I'm going to pass so that we can go to the next.
Very good. Nice. We can
ask me more questions. Okay.
Let's start with the next.
It's coming up. Yeah.
Okay.
Switch that.
Where's the computer?
I have the computer.
So thanks so much for having our paper in the program. This paper, again, is about Brazil. Maybe by the end of this session, you will learn a lot about Brazil. Okay, so this is a joint work with my co-authors at the World Bank and in Hong Kong University. This paper started around COVID, and if you ask me why is it still not out there yet, it's I blame it on the work when you're working with the World Bank people. That's how it okay, so
recorded,
no, it's a joke. So just okay. So the usual disclaimer slide. Okay. All right. So what is the motivation of our paper? The motivation of the paper is that the fiscal policy. Cash transfer is an important fiscal policy tool for poverty reduction, counter-cyclical stimulus. There was 500 million recipients of cash transfer before COVID, and it increased to 1.4 billion people in 2021. And so it's important to understand the macro consequence of cash transfer. Okay? So in the theory, the macro effects of cash transfer depends on many factors, and it is theoretically ambiguous. Right? So cash transfer can be large. The effects on the GDP can be large and positive if it is spent on local goods, there are sticky prices and wages in the economy, there's labor market slackness, but it can also be small, even negative, if the transfer is being saved, it's spent on imports, or household reduced labor supply. Okay? And so there's a large empirical macro literature. I'm trying to understand, how this cash transfer affects people, household decision on the labor supply, but less is known about the macro effects on GDP, especially in developing countries. Okay? There are some exceptions, but I'm going to mention that throughout in my presentation. And so what this paper is trying to do is the following. So we ask the following questions. What are the short-run macro impacts of cash transfer in developing countries? Specifically on the local GDP and employment, okay? And can an open economy Keynesian model rationalize the empirical finding? So the approach that we're going to take, and I want to emphasize, is that most of our paper is actually going to be empirical, and we're going to take our empirical approach is we're going to estimate the short-run macro impacts of Brazil's cash transfer program called Bolsa Familia. We're going to use to identify the cash transfer, the exogenous cash transfer effects. We're going to use basic instruments, which is essentially using a heterogeneous exposure of states to changes in Bolsa Familia in the national level. Okay? And we're going to exploit the variation across the 27 states in Brazil between 2004 and 2019. Okay? And we're going to compute the relative GDP multiplier. And I want to emphasize that this is the relative GDP multiplier, meaning that we're going to see what we are computing is that when a state receives a higher transfer, say $1, compared to other states, so what happens to its GDP relative to other states? So we are differencing out, the macro, like the common factors, say monetary policy or fiscal policy changes. Okay, so it's not a usual aggregate multiplier. And I'm going to, because it's only 30 minutes, I'm going to go just, instead of giving an overview of what we have, I'm just going to go straight to what this program is, in case you don't know. So Bolsa Familia program is a conditional cash transfer program targeting the poor and extremely poor in Brazil. The goal is to expand the social protection benefits in Brazil. So essentially before 2004, when it first implemented, there was some cash transfer program, but it was in different, like smaller program. And so they repackaged it and add additional, benefit and call it a Bolsa Familia program. It started in 2004, as I said, with 2 types of benefit per month. There's a basic benefit, which is for the extremely poor families. They receive 50 real per month, which is about $32 PPP. And there's another type of benefit, which is the variable benefit, and this is for the poor, extremely poor, for the poor family, and they can receive an extra 15 real per child. So there are 2 thresholds that they sort the households into. One is extremely poor when they are earning less than 50 real per month, and the poor is less than 100. Of course, this threshold changes a little bit over time. It's means tested and conditioned on health testing and going to school. So you are not when you are poor, you can be ineligible. You can be eligible in the program, but you may still be kicked out. Okay. So this program is designed and funded by the federal government, but it's implemented by the local government. Okay? So the federal government defines the national eligibility. So the threshold that I just told you, whether you are poor or extremely poor, that's decided by the federal government. And then the benefit schedule is also decided by the federal government. And then the federal governments allocate quotas to each of the area based on some information such as the household survey. Okay? So this quota means that, at the beginning especially, some region may have more people who are eligible for the program, but they may not be able to enroll in the program because the local area meets the quota. Okay? And there are many changes over 2004 and 2019, such as eligibility rule, the payment scheme, and the quota. And so our paper is going to exploit all of these changes over time in Bolsa Familia. Okay? And you say, okay, how large is this program? So I can say that this is probably one of the largest programs in, in South America, one of the newest, the largest and early on of the cash transfer program. So in 2012, a fourth of the population in Brazil is in this program, and it costs 0.6% of GDP. Okay? Yes?
So all the changes to Bolsa Familia were aggregate changes that at the national level that affected all states the same.
Well, it will affect the eligibility, the rules will affect all the states in the same way.
Yes, but there are differences. So what you are going to do is to exploit differences across states because there are different amount of poor people.
Exactly.
Yes. So a little worried about that identification.
I will talk about that in a
good.
Yeah. Okay. So I would talk about the identification assumptions and what we try to do to address some of it. Okay, so the main specification that we have is the following. So on the left-hand side is the change in output in the state S. Okay, and we're going to regress it on the change in Bolsa Familia at state S is a share of GDP in time t minus 1. And so we can also include time and state fixed effects, okay, and maybe some additional control. Okay, so this beta 0 is going to be this relative multiplier that I talked about before. It's saying that suppose once the state S receive $1 more compared to other states, what happened to their output relative to other states? Okay? So because we have time fixed effects, we're going to control for all these aggregate shocks and aggregate policies. So it's not the same as the aggregate multiplier. Okay. So I'm going to explain what is the identification here. So the identification, the main concern is, as we all understand here, is that, you can have an OLS problem because, if the state that has an adverse shock to that state, then there are more, poverty and then more transfer to that state, right? So OLS can be downward bias. So partially we're not too worried in the sense that this is a federally designed program. So maybe, the common endogeneity concern is is a bit less, but obviously, that would not go through. We're going to be rejected right away. And so there's other concern, for example, there's augmented variable bias. So when we include this time and state fixed effects, there may still be some time varying factors that affect both the transfer as well as GDP, right? And so we're going to add some control in one of the specification, and I'm going to explain what it is. Okay, so first, let me just explain what the instrument we're going to have. So instrument we're going to have essentially the Batik shift share instrument that's using the heterogeneous state exposure. So the heterogeneous state exposure gamma S, so this is the state S exposure, is going to be a share. It's a ratio of Bolsa Familia as a share of this GDP in the first year that that Bolsa Familia is in relative to the national share. Okay? And so what is this gamma S is going to tell you? It says that if the national Bolsa Familia is changing by 1% of GDP, the transfer to state S is going to change by gamma S. So what is the intuition? Well, actually, before the intuition, what's the identifying assumption here? So the identifying assumption here is that there's no unobserved factors that affect Bolsa Familia that is both correlated with national Bolsa Familia in the time series, right, as well as differentially affect growth in states that are more sensitive to national Bolsa Familia. So I can think about something that can violate this identifying assumption, which is, say, there was some business cycle shocks that affects Brazil as a whole, but it affects the poorer state more than the richer state.
For the poor people.
Yes.
More than the rich people. That would be enough.
Right.
So
then the way that we're going to, how do we do that? So how do we address this concern? So that we have two specifications in the baseline. So in the first specification, what we call parsimonious specification. We only have time and state and year fixed effects. And the second one is what we call benchmark specification, where we add this control, which is a state sensitivity to the national business cycle. Okay, so which is essentially it's just each state we have this. We're going to compute the sensitivity. We're going to add essentially there are 27 states, so there are 27 controls where this is the national GDP. So we're worrying about that. So that's why we have that in the benchmark specification. Okay. And so what is the intuition for this instrument? The intuition for this instrument is based on this graph. So here I plot you the over time. So in the dark line is the Bolsa Familia, changing Bolsa Familia transfer at the national level. Okay? Then the red line is the north. And the blue line is the south. So you can see here essentially in Brazil, most of a lot more poorer people are in the north versus the south. So you can see that essentially, in the terms of time series, the north is like it moves the same as the Bolsa as the national, but it's magnified a lot because there are more poor people. While the south is like Rio de Janeiro, they are mostly they are richer, and so you see that it's relatively smooth compared to the national. Okay, I'm going to skip a slide.
So where's the oil in Brazil? So 14-15 was a big oil shock.
Right, there was a commodity price cycle too.
Exactly.
Yes. And
but unfortunately, it coincides with the big changes in Bolsa Familia.
So that's why I also have it in my robustness check. That I have this commodity price index that I also interact with the state. So actually it turns out that the poorer state actually don't have a lot of commodity compared, relative to other states. Okay, so here is the main result of the paper. So so as I said, there are two specification in our paper, the parsimonious and the benchmark. And so I'm highlighting in red the two stage least square estimates. And so you can see the relative multiplier for the parsimonious is 2, and the benchmark is 3, over 3. Okay? And because there are only 27 states and there are only 15 years of data, we also have to show that we understand there are some econometric issues. And so we compute lots of standard errors to see, whether this result is significant, and I could say it is significant. And so to understand a bit of, where is this result coming from, so we look at the tradable versus non-tradable sectors relative output multiplier, and you can see, if I just want to show you here, so for the benchmark, you can see that most of the increase in the output is due to the non-tradable sector. Okay? The change in the tradable sector is small and it's very imprecise. I can reject 0. Okay? So when we first found this result, we're like, this is too big. Okay? But then, so for example, because if I look at the government spending multiplier in Amy and John's paper, it's 1.5 in the US. One of our co-authors' paper found that for the permanent social security transfer in the US, the multiplier is only 1.5 or so. So we kind of puzzle. But at the same time, if we look at the more of a developing countries context. So for example, Dennis, Igor, and Ted Miguel and co-authors in Econometrica found that the multiplier is 2.5 in a one-off transfer in an RCT in a Kenyan village. Okay? And Corby and his co-author in the Restart found that an implied multiplier of 2 in Brazil municipality. So it was not way too off, like crazy as we expected. Right? And then because we have a panel data, we can also look at the cumulative multiplier. That is, the effects of changes in transfer multiplier today, up to 3 years from now. So you can see, okay, we plot this 90% confidence band. So it's a little, as you see, our estimate is quite imprecise, but at the same time, it shows. So the red one is the benchmark, and the blue one is the baseline. And you can see that the output multiplier is cumulative output multiplier is quite persistent. It's larger than 1, even in 3 years after the shock. Okay. Then we will worry that what we're looking at is output, not output per capita. So maybe there are people moving around. Why we don't use output per capita in the baseline? So to be completely transparent here is that we don't believe the population data too much in the state level. Okay? It's quite noisy. It can be very different in different sources, and so we try our best to look at output per capita. So in this case, you can see that the benchmark estimate for output per capita multiplier is 2.96. So it's a little lower than the total output. And I think the reason is, as you can see, that the population did increase in the state that got more transfer. Okay. But at the same time, the large output per capita multiplier is just telling you that it's not just because people move to a different state.
So why do you actually find this effect on population? Do you have an explanation for that? Why would we expect a positive effect?
Maybe the poor people just in a different state.
But the eligibility is the same across states,
right? But then they also have a quota. So then maybe they think that, it's easier to get it into, the neighboring state. Like the demand increases, and so they could say, there are more jobs there, they move.
Do you have information on how binding these quotas are?
It is binding, especially in the first few years of the program. That is, there are more people eligible than the quota. But eventually the quota get also revised because they have more information as time goes. Then yeah. As binding. Okay. And then we also look at the labor markets. So in the labor market, we actually look at the 3 different types of employment. Okay, the formal employment, and then the informal employment. So what we really like about our paper is that we have a measure of how informal employment changed due to this cash transfer. And this is actually quite, we didn't see this in the literature. And the reason is that at the state level, we can use this informal employment data coming from this household survey. And it's representative informal employment is representative at the state level, but not at, say, municipality level. So actually, when we started this project, we were thinking we would use municipality data, and then we realized that, first, the GDP was not very well measured municipality. Second, we can't look at the informality, informal employment, which is large in Brazil and many developing countries. And so we decided that we look at the states. So the problem with the state, as you can see, is that, our estimate can be very imprecise. Right? So there's a trade-off, but, yeah.
But perhaps, given the measurement problems, perhaps you could use light at night and electricity use as instruments?
So we haven't checked how this, how it changes over time too, really, because I think it also it's only 15 years, and I'm not really sure if that has enough variation to be correlated with how much to be a good instrument. But yeah, we can check it. Okay. And then the third measure that we look at is what we call a formal wage equivalent employment. The idea here is that, a formal job is different from an informal job. So if you want to look at the total employment, you may skew it because, informal jobs just don't earn as much. And so we weight formal and informal employment by the wage. Okay? So quickly, we find that, there's a lot of numbers here. I apologize, but what we see here is that the formal employment, there's some evidence that there's a negative formal employment, meaning formal employment falls, but then it's imprecise because you see that all of the p-value is essentially much larger than 0.1. Okay? Then we see the significant increase in informal employment. And so then if you look at the formal wage employment, meaning the total employment in the economy, you don't really see much of the changes in employment. Okay? So, so that's the main result for the formal employment. I'm going to skip this because I want to talk a bit about the other stuff that we try to control for. So we were very worried about many other factors that we didn't control in the baseline. And so each time we add this control, we were holding our breath, and somehow we are still going through. So the first thing is, for example, the commodity price. That there's a commodity price super cycle in business, in Brazil that has been talking about in the literature. So we include the commodity price interacted with the state dummy to control that whether this will affect each state differently. Again, we don't see the changes. I mean, the multiplier is still 2.5, 2.6. Then the other thing is the minimum wage. Okay, the minimum wage may also be different, affecting. There was minimum wage law changes, and it might coincide with this was familiar over time, and so we add that. Also interacted with the state dummy, and so you see that it's still, the multiplier is still 2.5, close to 0.55. And then we worry about, other federal transfer, the tax revenue, lack of all these both familiar and output. Essentially, we try to include all of this, and we still see that the multiplier, the benchmark multiplier, is between 2 and 3. Okay? And so since I have 5 minutes of the presentation, I'm just gonna try to explain, talk a little bit about where our model comes in. So we want to interpret the model, the result in the lens of the model, and often the case, at least at this point, is that there's a lot. We see this New Keynesian open economy, New Keynesian model that has explained a lot of this empirical finding in advanced countries, so in the U.S. And so we say, okay, suppose we take a very relatively standard New Keynesian model and calibrate it more specifically for Brazil. What does it say about this local multiplier? And so what do we have in the model? It's a closed economy in the sense that there are a closed economy that has a common monetary policy, and the economy has 2 regions. Right? And one region is the poor, and that's the transfer from the rich from the other region. And there are 2 types of household. There's the Ricardian type of household, as well as the hand-to-mouth households. Okay? And transfer are permanent and fully targeted to the hand-to-mouth household. Okay? I'm going to skip the equation. I'm going to explain too much of this. So let me tell you the main result of the transfer of the model part. Okay? So on the left-hand side is the cumulative relative output multiplier, and I plot the black line and the black dotted line, the benchmark, and the parsimonious estimate, right, with a 90% confidence band. So in the baseline model, which is the red line, okay, is the open economy New Keynesian model that we calibrate for Brazil with the GHH preferences. Okay?
Can you just ask you?
Yeah.
When you do this experiment, you do it as you hold the share of constrained agents and give them more money?
Yeah.
Or do you? But that's not what you did in the empirical work, because there you vary both the share of constrained and how much money they get. So that's the variation you're exploiting. You're saying that you should do the same in the model.
No, so
that would be a way to address. In the data, you check how much more does output expand when you have more constrained agents.
No, it's not more constrained.
That's a different if. That's a different if. That's the variation you're exploiting.
Okay.
When you are doing the Bartik, you are exploiting that some states have fewer poor people, and therefore their increase is going to be smaller.
Right.
You can do the same in the model.
Yeah.
You should actually.
So the answer is So right now in the calibration, we have symmetric between, in terms of hand-to-mouth people in the the two regions. But sure, we can also change that because one region is richer, just like the empirics. It doesn't change so much. The reason is that this the main idea is that these are hand-to-mouth, and the transfer is almost permanent. Okay? So these guys, once they are in the program, they just stay. So that whether you have a lot, actually. This result doesn't change much if we change the number, the relative hand-to-mouth versus, Ricardian household policy for the poor state. Okay? And so because we're running out of time again, but so what I'm going to try to say here is the following. So you can see that this in the baseline, the Euclidean model, the red line, you can see that it is on impact, it can be quite close, right, to our estimate. It's actually 2.5. What is missing is that in the longer horizon, as prices and wages adjust, prices adjust. What happens is that the multiplier becomes smaller and smaller, and this orange line is essentially the model when there's no price stickiness. Okay, it's a neoclassical model. Then you get a close to zero or even negative multiplier. Okay. And one thing that we have in the model is that right now we're still changing a little bit, is that we say, okay, what we observe though is that if you have in the model, if you have a large multiplier, it's really driven by labor changes, right? So if you can see, so if you can see here in this graph, this is the on-impact labor change. So then if you have in the baseline, labor changes a lot, but in the data, you see it almost, as I said, it's close to zero. So how do we deal with that? Well, one idea is that, in this literature, also in the macro literature, that there's a lot of variable utilization, right? So firms can change their input easily. And so what happens is that if you add variable utilization into the model as a way to, flatten the marginal cost curve, what happens is, as you can see here, is that you need less changes in labor in order to generate a larger multiplier, but at the cost of, again, still lowering the multiplier on impact. Okay? So I'm going to conclude by just discussion a little bit about the mechanism. What we think is still missing, at least in the model, is the supply side benefit of the transfer from the micro development, literature, such as physical capital. We didn't have capital in the model. Possibly higher productivity through better matches and decision making, and there's also this idea that this transfer also helps to reduce this financial stress. And the financial stress story has been emphasized by Yuri and Dimitri and Chen Lian in the research, where essentially when you get a transfer, they have less financial stress, so they can increase the effective labor supply. So that type of of channel is missing in our model. Okay, so I'm going to conclude and then say that what we'll in this paper we estimate the relative output multiplier, and we see a large and persistent impact on local GDP, but not much on employment. In fact, a lot of the action comes from the informal employment. An open economy indicator model with utilization can partially rationalize our results, but especially in the longer horizon, it misses the persistent effects on the economy. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me to discuss this very nice paper. So the paper deals with the research question, how large transfer multipliers are in developing countries. And this is obviously an important question for a number of reasons. So, for example, you may be a developing country government, and you may want to actually just redistribute and raise the fortunes of the poor in your country. This is sort of the question that this paper answers most directly. So the evidence in this paper directly bears on this question. But more generally, maybe we can learn something from this sort of cash transfer literature about the size of overall multipliers. And that's obviously a long-standing question in economics, and that's sort of something this paper may also help us learn something about it. And evidence from this paper comes from Bolsa Familia, as was very well explained, sort of transfer program targeted towards the poor. And the main findings are that we really see massive multipliers that are much larger than we are sort of used to if we look at, for example, like Valerie Rami's textbook handbook, where there's mostly multipliers that are like around 1 or below 1, maybe slightly above, but nowhere near just large. So what I want to do in this discussion is, again, just, this should really be a striking result, a multiplier of 3 basically means, you would mean, if we take it at face value, invest $1 and you sort of raise local GDP by $3, that obviously sounds very good. Especially here, if we think about this coming without an increase in factor supply, so it could be that people are just working much more, then the welfare calculation would be a little bit more complicated. But what we actually see here is that this happens without an increase in labor supply, which makes it even better because it makes GDP potentially more directly sort of translate into welfare. But there are some, caveats to this result in the paper, and some of which have to do with the identification strategy. So just, how credible are these estimates? And I think this is sort of related to some of the discussion that was already going on during the talk. And then also, obviously, the interpretation. We really have to keep in mind that this is a relative multiplier, which the paper does very carefully. But I think it's just, useful to point that out once more, how that object that's being estimated in this paper differs from, the sort of typical fiscal multiplier that people have been estimating in macro for like 30 to 40 years. Talking about the research design, so one thing the paper I think does very nicely is by aggregating things to the state level, it can actually capture already a lot of these spillovers that a program like Bolsa Familia will have, for example, across villages or municipalities. So this is sort of the key strength of this paper relative to 2 competing papers in Econometrica that are looking at, for example, an RCT-induced variation, or a paper by Gerard et al., which is also in Econometrica. They use Bolsa Familia to derive municipal-level demand shocks, which are, I would say, maybe potentially more credible in the sense that they are uncorrelated with, for example, the poverty share in the municipality. So that's sort of a benefit, which obviously this approach does not have. But then you really have to be worried about, if you use this very granular variation, you really have to specify where the money goes. So, you need to know about spillover networks between municipalities or Kenyan villages. And that's obviously, a tall empirical task that this paper sort of elegantly avoids by just aggregating things to the state level. And also at the state level, there are many things that we can measure pretty well. So, for example, intermediates are always like an issue about how to do that. At the imported intermediates are like a huge deal at a very granular scale. But here at the state level, there is a sort of a good accounting of that. So this is sort of the benefit of doing things at a sort of more macro level, and this is also really what the paper emphasizes, that this is a macroeconomic assessment of cash transfers. But if we, think about the challenges, then, we have to ask, what does this instrument here really capture? What is sort of the natural experiment that we are really exploiting here? And when we think about it, it's a little bit difficult to, at least to me, intuitively explain what the natural experiment is here. Because when you think about at the national level, the Brazilian government presumably follows, macro shocks in terms of how it sets its fiscal policy. And then we are asking, suppose there's a crisis and the Brazilian government feels the need to consolidate its budget, cut spending on the poor. Then we are asking, what is the differential effect in poor versus rich regions? And, ultimately the macro shock that's driving the budget may also, differentially affect these regions. And that's something that this paper ultimately, can try to address and does through, for example, looking at commodity prices that may affect the budget and also the poor. But ultimately, I think this is sort of a measurement challenge where, aggregate shocks may transmit heterogeneously across regions, and the extent to which you can address that is obviously, limited by the measurement. So this is sort of a comment on identification. And the second one is more just, interpreting these estimates as relative multipliers, which, again, the paper is very careful to point out that this is a relative transfer multiplier. But I think it's important to sort of, remind us to what extent does this object differ from the aggregate multiplier. And so there are two things going on here. One is just, we may be worried that because of spillovers, this transfer multiplier may in fact be mismeasured. So it could be that, productive inputs are going from the control to the treatment group. So there could be migration, there could be reallocation of capital. There's some evidence in the paper that there are some effects from migration. And this could just mean that we are overstating the relative multiplier. So this is one way in which we should sort of worry about these general equilibrium effects. And the second one, I think, is potentially, even more important, and I think this is sort of what essentially creates this disconnect between the, cross-regional literature that was started by, Nakamura and Stanton, and the aggregate literature. And it's at the moment, I would say, there's a little bit of an impasse because we don't really know how to connect these two. And that is because, at the aggregate level, there will be sort of general equilibrium adjustments that are common to all regions and that are here differenced out. So, for example, we could think about, a budget response. Eventually, the Brazilian government may have to balance its budget again. And, depending on how taxes are raised here, this could lead to a substantially smaller aggregate multiplier. In fact, Valerie Rami has an example in her textbook where she reviews this approach, where, in fact, the regional multiplier is maybe 2, but actually the national multiplier is 0 if it's offset by lump sum tax increases that are uniformly going against all regions. Obviously, again, the paper is very aware of this. I'm just to just point this out. And the other issue is inflation. So on inflation, I think it's important that many goods are priced in spatial equilibrium. So trying to detect these differences in local price indices may be hard. So the effect on inflation may also be a missing intercept. We also have a missing intercept problem. So that may then also eat away at the national multiplier and mean that there's again this discrepancy between how effective the policy is in terms of raising aggregate GDP versus redistributing it. So those are, I think, the two main issues that I want to flag in terms of interpretation. And then I think there's sort of the final bit is sort of what are the sort of development economics of these large multipliers in poor regions. So I think now there's accumulating evidence that in the US the regional multipliers may be 1 to 1.5, and in developing countries it's maybe 2.5 to 3. So there seems to be a bit of a productivity effect going on, and I think this is sort of I think the thing that we most directly learn from these studies. So one thing that I've also worked on with my co-authors, it seems to be that there's a lot of slack. So this result that there's an increase in GDP without an increase in observable factors of production. That's not specific to this paper. So what generates that? I think in our paper and here in the extension, we argue it's utilization. So potentially there's a hidden factor that's very elastically supplied. You could have other theories which are sort of focusing more on the supply side. I think this was also mentioned in the conclusion. I think this is maybe also something where in the Brazilian context, where there are larger firms that are doing more investment and so on, where we could actually leverage some of these research designs to learn more about what is driving these very large output multipliers. So, there's a bunch of older literature that suggests that such demand shocks may coordinate us to an entirely different equilibrium. And maybe in Brazil, this would be something that is useful to explore. But overall, I think it's a very well executed paper on trying to measure the relative transfer multiplier in a developing country context. Try to emphasize, some of the potential limitations of the research design, and just explain to what extent does the relative multiplier differ from the aggregate one. But overall, I think this is a very nice research agenda, and I'm especially excited to see how we can sort of leverage this information to learn more really about the development economics that are sort of going on here. What are the constraints that create this difference in relative multipliers between US and a country like Brazil or Kenya? But thanks a lot.
Any more questions, or you want to respond a bit? Or?
I would just respond very quickly, I think. So thanks for the great comments and suggestions. I think the first one is, in terms of like the identification, I agree that, it's we try our best with whatever we have, and of course it's not as clean as the RCT. I have to say that. And then the second thing, there's pros and cons, right? And then the second thing about the spillover. So we worry about spillover. So we, in one of the robustness check, we add the, how outputs in other neighboring states responds. In the control, and we don't we don't see much difference in terms of the multiplier, so we're not as worried about the spillover. And in terms of like the aggregate multiplier, so our model also has a indication about the aggregate multiplier, and we actually have the same thing as Valerie. That is, in the aggregate, it's actually quite small. It's less than 1. It's because this is a permanent transfer, and so most of the time, the foreign region that get taxed for this transfer, the consumption goes down. Right? And so I think, I would have to admit that the weakest part of the paper, I guess, is that, we don't have more evidence in terms of, say, how consumption or investment responds at the state level. I think those would be helpful in terms of, identify more of the supply side channel. We wish we could, but we didn't have it.
Maybe 2 more questions, I think.
Do you know something about the micro-level MPCs out of these cash transfers? Outside of your paper, I guess.
So in Kenya or like the Malawi, that's the Dennis Eager and his team find that the MPC within say a year is essentially 1. But I mean, it depends a lot on what you count as consumption also. So it's harder to, I would say that, we don't really know if it's MPCs 1 or is this because, they buy something like a roof and you count it as consumption. Jeff?
So we talk a lot about bias and things like that when we do these 2SLS identifications. But it seems like what we should be talking about is whether this is useful for identifying general equilibrium effects, not whether it's biased or true. Right. What can you comment a bit on whether, even if Vettel is completely right, which he's never been, that this is useful for understanding the effects of GE anti-poverty program? That's ultimately what we care about.
So that's a harder question to answer. I guess,
why I discussed your other.
The way that this program, the way that the identification works is really, it's like diff and diff. So it's like you are identifying the relative multiplier. There's no, you difference out this, macro policy. So I think it's this missing intercept problem, which is it's common in this whole, cross-country.
Theory is telling us that at an individual level, the macro adjustment is the micro adjustment plus adjustments to general equilibrium price changes.
So, right. But at the same time, as I said, from the empirical point of view, you just don't cleanly identify this effects, and that's why people need to use, a lot of times they use model in order to find, so if you have this local multiplier, you have all this channel in, so then if you have in a model with the general equilibrium, what would be the aggregate effect? And of course, people disagree on, what that would happen because it's different in terms of taxes, how taxes work or how monetary policy responds, in the aggregate, that it can also have, have an impact on the aggregate. And in the empirics, you just, at least from my point of view, you just don't clearly identify it from the state level or, municipality or village level identification.